The tray shook in Prudence Hale's hands only once, and only because the name Vane had been spoken aloud in a room where she was not supposed to exist at all. She had come in with the second remove, cream soup for 8, meaning to set it down and withdraw before anyone noticed her, the way Mrs. Doyle had taught her in her first week at Bramwell Hall. The Earl's aunt, Lady Beatrice Fairfax, chose that exact moment to lean toward the gentleman on her right and say, in the carrying whisper of a woman who wished to be overheard, that the Vane family's solicitor had filed papers again over the water meadow, and that it was a disgrace the case had dragged on so long that a girl could grow from infancy to marriage without once seeing the dispute settled. 2 footmen exchanged a glance over the sideboard and said nothing, because saying nothing was the oldest skill taught in that house. Prudence set the last bowl down with both hands. Carefully, the way a person sets down something they are afraid of dropping for reasons that have nothing to do with the bowl. Her own father held 40 acres that bordered that meadow. She had grown up on the sound of that word, Vane, spoken the way other families spoke of frost or fever, a thing that arrived without asking and took what it wanted. She felt, rather than saw, the Earl look up. Julian Fairfax sat at the head of his own table with a stillness that the other guests mistook for boredom. His eyes found her for the length of one breath, no longer, and something in his face did not move at all, which was itself a kind of movement. The way a held breath is still a kind of breathing. Then he looked back to his aunt and said only that the matter was for his solicitor and not for the dinner table, and the talk turned, and Prudence was permitted to disappear again into the corridor, where she stood for a moment with her back against the cold plaster and her hand pressed flat over the pocket of her apron. Inside that pocket, folded into a square no larger than a prayer book, was a letter she had carried against her body for 3 months and could not read one word of. She did not know whose hand had written it. She knew only that her grandmother had pressed it into her palm on the morning she died, closing Prudence's fingers over it with a grip that had no strength left anywhere else in her body, and had said, "Keep this safe. Keep it safer than you have ever kept anything," and had not lived long enough to say why. Prudence Hale could not read. Nobody in her family had ever been taught, not her father, not her grandmother before her, and there had never seemed reason enough to spend the coin a hedge school charged when there was barley to get in and a roof that leaked every autumn. She had learned to recognize her own name if it was written plainly, and the shape of the word sold on a grocer's sign, and nothing more. Her grandmother had died in March, in the small back room of the Hale farmhouse, with the window open despite the cold, because she had asked for it, saying she wanted to hear the lambs. Prudence had sat with her 3 nights running, wringing cloths in a basin gone cold, listening to a breathing that grew thinner each hour. And it was on the last of those nights, near dawn, that the old woman had roused herself with a strength that frightened Prudence more than any fever had, and reached beneath her own pillow for the folded square of paper she must have kept there, unseen, for years. She had not explained where it came from. She had said only the one instruction: keep it safe. Keep it safer than you have ever kept anything. And had closed her eyes again, and by the time the cockerel sounded in the yard, she was gone. And Prudence was left holding a stranger's secret, with no one left alive to tell her whose it was. The letter in her pocket was, to her eyes, a field of marks with no more meaning than frost patterns on a window, and she had carried it for 3 months the way a person carries a coal that has stopped burning but might not have, wrapped close, watched, never quite trusted to set down. She smoothed her apron over it now and went back to the kitchen, where Mr. Grimshaw the steward was waiting to tell her, not for the first time, that a girl who could not so much as read a receipt had no business being trusted with the good china, and that he did not know what Mrs. Doyle had been thinking. Prudence said nothing. She had learned that silence cost her less than defense. She did not yet know that the square of paper against her ribs held the only sentence in England that could end, in one reading, a feud that had outlived 3 of the people who started it. The spring she turned 22, Prudence had been in service at Bramwell Hall for 11 months, ever since her grandmother's death had left her father unable to feed 2 daughters on 40 contested acres and no wife to help him. Her younger sister Alice had stayed on the farm to keep house. Prudence had gone up to the great house on the hill because the great house paid a girl £6 a year and her keep, and because Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper, had known her grandmother and had a kindness in her that outweighed Mr. Grimshaw's contempt. Bramwell Hall stood on a rise above the river, grey stone against a sky that was, that spring, more often the color of pewter than of anything warmer. Below it, where the land dropped toward the water, lay the meadow everyone in 3 parishes called Denby Ford, 60 acres of grazing and a ford shallow enough to cross a cart in dry weather, claimed on paper by the Fairfax estate, and claimed in practice, stubbornly, by the tenants of Hartwell Grange 4 miles upriver, where the Vane family had held land since before anyone living could say for certain who had first laid a fence across it. The dispute was older than Prudence, older than her father, old enough that most people who spoke of it no longer remembered its cause, and simply understood it the way they understood the weather, as a condition of the land itself. Prudence understood more than most, because her grandmother had once been maid to a Vane, in the years before the 2 families had stopped speaking to each other entirely, and some of what her grandmother had not said aloud had settled into the family the way silt settles into a slow river, present without being visible. The house Prudence served was not unkind to her exactly. Mrs. Doyle taught her the turning of linens and the polishing of silver with a patience Prudence had not expected from a stranger. The younger housemaids, Sally and Nan, shared their bread with her, and did not mind that she could not read the labels on the pantry jars, so long as she memorized which jar held what by shape and weight, which she did within a fortnight. It was only Mr. Grimshaw and Lady Beatrice, when she troubled to notice a servant at all, who made Prudence feel the particular smallness of being a girl who could carry a full tray across a crowded room without spilling a drop and still be considered, by the people who mattered, barely capable of thought. She had grown used to it. She told herself, most nights, that a girl in her position had no business wanting to be seen, that wanting was a door that opened only onto disappointment, and that the safest course was to do her work well and let the wanting starve quietly in some back room of her chest where nobody could see it either. She had told herself this for 11 months. She was not certain, lying awake that spring with her grandmother's letter beneath her pillow where she had taken to keeping it after dark, that she believed it any longer. The Earl of Bramwell had inherited the title 4 years before Prudence came into his service, at 26, when his father died of an apoplexy brought on, the servants said in low voices, by the strain of the Water Meadow case, and by a grief that had never properly healed since long before that. Julian Fairfax governed his household the way he governed his land, precisely, without waste, without warmth that anyone could point to and name. He was not cruel. He paid his people fairly, and did not raise his voice. Still, he moved through his own house like a man walking through a room he did not quite believe belonged to him, and the servants had long since stopped expecting anything from him beyond correctness. Mrs. Doyle, who remembered him as a boy, trailing after his father's dogs and laughing without restraint, sometimes looked at him across the breakfast table and seemed to be searching for that child among the ledgers, and never quite finding him there. It was Mrs. Doyle who first sent Prudence up to the old library to help catalogue his late father's papers, because the assizes were coming in the autumn, and the solicitor had written twice asking for every document touching the Denby Ford boundary that could be found. Prudence could not read the papers, of course. Her task was simpler and more tedious, to sort by handwriting and seal and hand every bundle to the solicitor's clerk for proper reading, working from a system Mrs. Doyle had shown her, matching wax colors and ribbon to the ledger the clerk kept in. It was there, on the third afternoon, dust thick in the slanted light from the tall windows, that Mr. Grimshaw found her kneeling among a scattered drift of old letters, and said in front of the clerk and in front of 2 footmen carrying in another crate, that it was a strange sort of economy, putting a girl who could not read a single line of it in charge of sorting the family's most important papers, and that he supposed the house had run out of better hands. Prudence kept her eyes on the seals in front of her, red and black, and a faded blue she had learned belonged to a family called Ashworth, and said only that she was sorting by wax and ribbon, as Mrs. Doyle had shown her, and that she had not misplaced a single bundle in 3 days. The clerk, a mild young man named Foster, said mildly that her system was, in fact, faster than his own, and Mr. Grimshaw made a sound in his throat and left, and Prudence's hands did not stop shaking until he was well down the corridor. She did not know that Julian had been standing in the library doorway for the length of that entire exchange, a ledger under his arm, and had not made his presence known, and had heard every word. The witnessing came a week later, on a morning when the weather had turned wet enough that the tenant families came up to the kitchen door of the great house, seeking the customary charity of a Wednesday, bread and broth for those whose own larders ran thin in the lean stretch before the first hay-cutting. Among them, that particular Wednesday, was a boy of perhaps 8, thin through the wrists, who had been caught the week before taking 2 apples from the orchard wall and had been threatened by Mr. Grimshaw with dismissal of his whole family from their cottage if it happened again. The boy's mother was not present. The boy stood at the back of the small crowd at the kitchen door, and when the bread came round, he took none, because Mr. Grimshaw stood watching with his arms folded, and the boy had understood, correctly, that he was being watched for the crime of hunger. Prudence saw it from the scullery window. She went out with a heel of bread wrapped in a cloth, ordinary enough that nobody remarked on a girl stepping into the yard, and put it into the boy's hands without a word, and turned back before Mr. Grimshaw could fix the moment in his mind as anything worth mentioning. She did not know that the Earl, returning early from a ride he had cut short on account of the rain, had reined in at the corner of the stable yard and watched the whole of it. The bread passed low and quick. The boy's face. Her own face giving away nothing at all. A girl doing a kindness precisely because no one was meant to see it. He said nothing to her that day. That evening, however, when Mrs. Doyle brought him the household accounts, he asked, without explaining why, whether the tenant families at the eastern cottages were finding the lean season very hard this year, and whether anything more might be done. Mrs. Doyle, who had served the Fairfax family for 30 years, and had never once heard her master ask such a question unprompted, said that she would look into it, and wondered privately what had put the notion into his head. Prudence, cleaning silver in the next room, heard none of this. She only noticed, over the following days, that the Earl's eyes found her more often than they had before, briefly, and that he did not look away as quickly as a man is meant to look away from a servant who has done nothing to earn particular notice. He found her again in the library the following week, bent over a crate of old estate correspondence long past the hour when the other servants had gone down to their supper, her hands cramped from sorting and a headache pressing behind her eyes that she had not admitted to anyone. He set a plate of bread and cold meat on the corner of the table without comment, and said only, "Eat something before you finish that crate," and left again before she could thank him. It was a command, plainly given, master to servant, and Prudence obeyed it, because refusing an order was not a liberty a maid possessed. She did not let herself wonder, not that night, why a man who rarely noticed whether the servants had dined at all had troubled to notice whether she had. It unsettled her more than Mr. Grimshaw's contempt ever had, contempt she knew how to carry. This, whatever it was, had no name she trusted herself to give it. If you have ever kept something close to your chest that you were not permitted to want, you already know what the next weeks of Prudence's spring felt like, and you may want to stay for how it resolved. The wound in Julian went back further than his father's death, though his father's death was where it had finally come to rest. He had been 9 years old the summer his father burned a box of old letters in the study grate. 3 years before Julian was even born, the story properly belonged to, though he had grown up hearing its edges the way a child grows up hearing the edges of any family grief, too large to be spoken whole. His father, then a young man, not yet the Earl, had been engaged to a girl from Hartwell Grange, Eleanor Vane, a match the two families had wanted for a generation to finally end the boundary quarrel between them. The engagement had lasted 8 months. Then, without warning that anyone outside Hartwell Grange had ever been given, Eleanor Vane had broken it, publicly, at an assembly in the market town, before 40 witnesses, and had refused ever afterward to say why. Julian's grandfather had called it an insult calculated to humiliate the Fairfax name before the whole county, and had gone to law over the Denby Ford boundary within the month, not because the land itself had newly changed hands, but because it was the only weapon close enough to reach. Julian's father, 22 years old and freshly wounded in a way no lawsuit could touch, had let his own father do it, and had never once, in the 30 years remaining to him, tried to stop it. He had also, that summer of Julian's 9th year, burned every letter Eleanor Vane had ever sent him. Julian remembered standing in the study doorway watching the paper curl and blacken in the grate, and remembered his father's face, which had not looked angry so much as finished, a door closing on a room he had decided never to enter again. What Julian's father had never told him, because he did not know it himself, was that Eleanor Vane had written one letter after the breach that she had never sent, entrusting it instead to her own maid on her deathbed, not 2 years later, with instructions Julian's father would never hear, because by then he had made himself unreachable to anyone bearing the Vane name. Julian grew into the belief, absorbed the way a child absorbs the temperature of a house rather than being told it directly. That gentleness toward a Vane was a door his family did not open, and that his father's coldness afterward, which had touched Julian too, more than he liked to admit, was simply the shape love took once betrayal had scarred it over. He had inherited the lawsuit along with the title, and had continued it not from conviction, but from a kind of grief he had never examined closely enough to name. The sense that ending it would mean agreeing his father's whole broken life had been for nothing. He thought of none of this directly on the evening he found himself standing longer than necessary in the library doorway, watching a maid who could not read sort 3 centuries of his family's correspondence with more care and more system than the clerk he was paying to do it. He thought of it even less on the morning he watched her give away bread she likely could not spare herself to a hungry boy who expected nothing from anyone. What he was capable of admitting, alone in his study that night, with his father's portrait above the mantel turned slightly toward the wall the way it had hung since Julian himself had turned it there at 19 and never turned it back, was only this: that he had spent his whole life being told what a Vane was worth, and none at all being told what a person was worth on her own account, without rank or reading to recommend her, and that the difference between those two educations had begun, without his permission, to matter to him. He did not act on it. Not yet. He told himself it would pass, the way a fever passes, and went back to his ledgers, and did not look at his father's turned portrait again that night. It was 3 days later, At a supper, Lady Beatrice had arranged to receive the visiting assize solicitor and smooth the ground before the autumn hearing, that the second voicing came. Prudence was carrying out the empty dishes when she heard her own name, unwitting, from the drawing-room beyond the half-open door. Lady Beatrice's voice, pitched for an audience of one but carrying, as it always did, further than she intended. "That girl who cannot even sign her own name," Lady Beatrice was saying to the solicitor. "Imagine trusting her near the boundary papers. I have told Julian a dozen times it reflects poorly on the household to give a common illiterate girl the run of the library." Whatever Mrs. Doyle's sentiment about her grandmother, she is a maid, nothing more, and ought to be reminded of it before she forgets her place entirely. Prudence stood very still in the corridor with the tray heavy in her hands, and did not go in. She had known, in some unexamined corner of herself, that this was how the house saw her. Hearing it said aloud, in that particular voice, to a stranger who would carry the opinion back to the county town, was a different thing from knowing it. It settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and she carried the dishes to the scullery and set them down without breaking a single one, which struck her afterward as the strangest part of the whole evening, that her hands had gone on being steady when nothing else in her had. She did not see Julian standing at the far end of the same corridor, having come to fetch a decanter himself rather than ring for it, and having heard every word his aunt said. He did not go into the drawing-room either. He went instead to the library, alone, and stood for a long while among the sorted bundles of his family's correspondence, and thought about a boy who had watched his father burn a box of letters and had never once, in 20 years, asked what any of them had said. The following week, word reached Hartwell Grange, 4 miles upriver, that something had been found among the Fairfax papers touching the old boundary, and Sir Aldous Vane's agent, a sharp-eyed man named Corbin, came down to make discreet inquiries at the servants' entrance, offering coin to any Bramwell servant who could confirm what the old papers said. He found Prudence in the kitchen garden, where she had gone to cut mint for the kitchen, and stood at the low wall with the ease of a man accustomed to being listened to, turning 2 silver crowns over in his palm, so the light caught them. He said he understood her grandmother had once been in service at Hartwell Grange itself, in the old Vane household, before the 2 families had ceased speaking, and that a woman in such a position might well have kept a paper or 2 as keepsakes, the sort of thing a granddaughter might not think worth mentioning to anyone. He offered her 2 crowns, more than a month of her wages, to tell him whether any letter bearing the Vane seal had turned up among the sorted bundles at the great house, or whether she herself, being a Hale, might know of any family paper never yet given up. Prudence's hand had gone, without her permission, to the place at her ribs where her grandmother's letter still lay hidden beneath her stays, wrapped now in a fresh square of linen. She did not know, even then, what the paper said. She knew only that her grandmother had died, gripping her hand, and begging her to keep it safe, and that a stranger offering coin for it, quietly, at a garden gate, was exactly the kind of moment her grandmother's warning had been shaped to meet. She told Corbin she knew nothing of any such letter, and that even if she had, she was not a woman who sold what did not belong to her, and she walked back into the house with her chin level and her hands, this time, not entirely steady. She did not see Julian watching from the stable yard, having come out to check a lame horse, and having recognized Corbin's face from an assize hearing 2 years before. That evening, he found an excuse to pass through the still room where Prudence was working alone, and stood a moment in the doorway before he spoke. "Come and sit by the fire when your work is finished tonight," he said, his voice low. "You look tired, and the kitchen fire burns longer than you are permitted to sit beside it." It was, on its surface, an order, the kind a master might give any servant grown pale with overwork. Prudence heard only the command in it, and answered that she was quite well. "Thank you, my lord," and that she had linens yet to finish. And he did not press her, and left. She did not understand, that night or for some while afterward, that a man who rarely spoke to his servants beyond what duty required had just told her, in the only language he trusted himself to use, that he had seen her turn away 2 crowns rather than betray a trust she did not even understand, and that it had moved him more than he knew how to say plainly. She lay awake instead, turning the moment over for a different reason. The warmth that had risen in her without leave the instant his voice went low and asked her to sit, a warmth entirely unbecoming in a maid toward her master, and told herself sternly that wanting was still the door she had promised herself never to open, whatever her own foolish heart seemed to think it heard in an ordinary command about a fire. The lawsuit came to its final hearing in the last week of September, at the assizes in the county town, and the whole of both households, Fairfax and Vane, made the journey to hear it settled, one way or the other, after 30 years. Prudence was not meant to attend. Servants did not attend assize hearings. Her father sent word 2 days before, however, that the tenant families along the eastern boundary, his own family among them, had been told informally by the Fairfax solicitor that whichever way the judgment fell, some tenancies would very likely be reassigned in the resettlement that followed, and that the Hale Farm's 40 acres, lying exactly along the disputed line, could not be promised safe. Her father had held that land since before Prudence was born, had mended its fences with his own hands every spring, had buried her mother in the small churchyard at its edge, and the thought of losing it to a line drawn afresh by men who had never once walked it themselves sat on him, the boy reported, like a stone he could not put down. Prudence's father was not a man who wrote, being no more lettered than his daughter, but he had walked 3 miles to send the message by a neighbor's boy, and the boy delivered it, standing in the Bramwell kitchen doorway with his cap in his hands, saying only that Mr. Hale asked his daughter to come home if she could be spared, because whatever the court decided, the family ought to face it together. It was Lady Beatrice who found Prudence weeping quietly over the request in the linen closet an hour later, and who chose that moment, in front of Sally and Nan and Mr. Grimshaw besides, to deliver the third voicing. "I do not know what use an illiterate farm girl imagines she can be to anyone at an assize hearing," Lady Beatrice said, her voice pitched for the whole corridor to hear. "She cannot read the judgment when it is given, cannot sign a single paper in her family's defense, cannot do anything at all, beyond stand in a doorway looking pitiable. Send her home if her father wants her, and do not trouble the house further with her difficulties. We have a hearing of our own to attend to." She left before Prudence could answer, which was, in its way, a mercy, because Prudence had no answer in her that would not have cost her the place entirely. It was Julian who found her an hour later, still in the linen closet, her eyes red and her hands folded over the front of her apron where, unknown to him, her grandmother's letter lay hidden. He did not ask what his aunt had said. He had heard it. Standing again where he should not have been standing, and something in him that had been circling this decision for weeks finally arrived at its edge. "Go home to your father," he said. "Take whatever time you need. Your place here will be kept for you." Prudence heard, in the words, only what his aunt had prepared her to hear, an easing out, a kindness that was really a door closing gently so as not to make a scene. She thanked him, curtsied, and left within the hour, walking the 3 miles home in a light rain with her grandmother's letter pressed once more beneath her hand. She did not cry until she was past the last bend in the lane, out of sight of the great house's chimneys, and then she cried the whole rest of the way for her father's uncertain land and her grandmother's unexplained grief, and most of all, for the small foolish hope she had let herself carry these past weeks, that a man of his rank might look twice at a maid who could not even write her own name and mean something lasting by it. She told herself, arriving wet and cold at her father's door, that she had lost in a single afternoon both her place in the world and the strange, undeserved warmth she had let herself feel toward a man who could never truly have meant it, and she believed herself entirely when she said it. She did not know that Julian had spent that same night writing and tearing up 3 separate letters to his aunt, informing her that Prudence's place at Bramwell Hall was not, in fact, in question, and that his own feelings on the matter were no longer his aunt's to arrange. He had not sent any of them. He told himself the hearing was 2 days away, and that nothing could be settled until it was, and did not examine too closely why that felt, even as he told himself so, like a coward's arithmetic. If you have ever mistaken someone's silence for their answer, you already know the shape of what came next, and you may want to see how far a person will walk to correct it once they understand. The assize hearing opened at 10 in the morning in a courtroom too small for the crowd that came to see 30 years of grievance finally weighed. Sir Aldous Vane sat with his solicitor on one side of the aisle, Julian with his own solicitor, and Lady Beatrice on the other, and the room between them full of tenants from both estates who had inherited the quarrel the way they had inherited their boots, without ever choosing it. Prudence had not meant to come. She had spent the 2 days at her father's farm listening to him and her sister speak in low, frightened voices about the 40 acres, and on the morning of the hearing, something in her, some restlessness she could not name, had made her put on her one good dress and walk the 7 miles into town, rather than sit at home waiting for a verdict to arrive second-hand. She arrived as the solicitors were laying out decades of surveys and deeds, arguing measurements no one in the room but the lawyers themselves fully followed, and she stood at the back among the other tenants, her grandmother's letter still against her ribs, and watched Julian's face across the crowded room, drawn and pale, a man carrying a weight that had nothing to do with acreage. It was during a pause, while the judge conferred with both solicitors over a disputed survey line, that old Mr. Prosser, the Fairfax family solicitor, sorting through a final box of papers Julian had sent over that very morning from the library, held up a folded sheet with a broken wax seal, faded to the color of dried blood, and asked aloud whether anyone present recognized the device pressed into it, a stag beneath a broken branch. The room went very quiet. It was the Vane seal. Everyone in 3 parishes knew the Vane seal. The letter, however, had never been in Julian's box. Mr. Prosser said as much, turning it over in evident confusion, saying he did not know how it had come to be mixed among the Fairfax papers at all, that it must have been placed there in error. Prudence felt her own heart stop for the length of one full breath, because she understood. With a certainty that arrived all at once and entirely without words, exactly whose hand had placed it there. She stepped forward from the back of the room, past tenants who did not know her, past Lady Beatrice's narrowed eyes, until she stood before the bench with her cheeks burning, and her voice, when it came, steadier than she had any right to expect of it. "That letter is not from your box, sir," she said. "It is mine. My grandmother gave it to me. I have carried it 3 months, and I cannot tell you what it says, because I was never taught my letters. But I know it was hers to keep, and mine to guard, and I believe, sir, that it may be the only thing in this room that was never meant for a courtroom at all." She drew her own copy from beneath her bodice then, the twin of the one in Mr. Prosser's hand, the letter her grandmother had pressed into her fingers on her deathbed, and held it out. "I have kept 2, she said. "This one has been mine since March. I did not know until this moment that there was another." The judge, more curious than strict, permitted it read. It was Eleanor Vane's hand, dated the autumn after her broken engagement, addressed to Edmund Fairfax, never sent. In it she wrote, plainly and without the ornament of a woman trying to persuade, that she had broken their engagement not from want of love, but because her own father had mortgaged Hartwell Grange, secretly, against the very meadow now in dispute, to cover gaming debts he dared not confess, and that she had feared, marrying into the Fairfax name while that debt stood hidden, dragging Edmund and his whole family into a ruin not their own to bear. She had chosen, she wrote, to break his heart cleanly, rather than let her father break his fortune slowly, and she had never stopped loving him, and she asked only, if the letter ever reached him, that he not think worse of her than the truth deserved. A silence followed the reading that seemed to hold the whole room still. 30 years of inherited grievance meeting. All at once, the small human sacrifice that had started it. Tenants who had grown up hating a name they had never troubled to question now stood shoulder to shoulder, Fairfax men beside Vane men, none of them quite certain where to look. An old farmer near the back, who had lost a strip of grazing to the dispute 20 years before, took off his hat without seeming to notice he had done it. It was Julian who crossed the room first, 3 long strides through a crowd that parted without being asked to, and stopped before Prudence with a stillness in his face that was, this time, unmistakably a kind of breaking open, rather than a holding closed. "Miss Hale is to be my wife, if she will have me," he said. "I claim her, freely, before every witness here." The words were few and plain, and cost him. Everyone in that room understood everything his family's pride had spent 30 years defending. Lady Beatrice's hand went to the back of the nearest bench, her composure for the first time in Prudence's acquaintance with her, visibly failing her, her mouth opening and closing on a protest that found no shape to take. Sir Aldous Vane, across the aisle, was weeping without troubling to hide it, an old man discovering at last why his Aunt Eleanor had gone to her grave, refusing ever to explain herself. Prudence stood in the center of it, with her grandmother's letter still in her hand, the paper that had cost so many people so much, simply by being carried faithfully by a woman who could not read a word of it, and found she had no answer ready that felt equal to the moment. And so she gave him the only one that was entirely true. "Yes," she said, "I will." The judgment, when it finally came that afternoon, mattered a good deal less to either family than the letter had. The boundary was settled, tenancies confirmed, the Hale Farm's 40 acres secured to her father outright, as part of the resettlement Julian himself proposed before the court rose. The room had already rendered its true verdict an hour earlier, however, in the silence that followed a maid's plain testimony and a nobleman's 3 plain sentences, and no survey line drawn afterward carried half that weight. The wedding took place at Bramwell Hall in December, quietly, with snow already lying along the drive and the water meadow below the house frozen white and still. The ford no longer a border between enemies, but simply a stretch of ice. 2 boys from Hartwell Grange and 2 boys from Bramwell were, that same afternoon, sliding across together while their grandfathers watched from the terrace and pretended not to smile. Prudence Fairfax, Countess of Bramwell now, sat that evening by the library fire with her husband, in the same room where she had once sorted his family's oldest griefs by the color of their wax, and opened a plain new book he had brought her from town, its pages entirely blank of any hand but her own to come. He had begun teaching her her letters himself, an hour each evening after supper, patient in a way the rest of the house had never quite believed him capable of. And that night, with the fire low and the snow ticking softly against the glass, she traced the shape of her own name onto the page for the first time in a script she had made herself, slow and careful, while he watched her hand rather than the page, the way he had once watched her carry a full tray across a crowded room and seen, before anyone else in that house had troubled to look, exactly what she was worth. Pressed flat between the book's first 2 pages, kept there on her own quiet insistence, lay a small sprig of dried heather that had fallen loose from Eleanor Vane's letter when it was finally unfolded in that crowded courtroom. 30 years pressed and still faintly gold. The only ornament either family's long quarrel had ever produced. And now, at last, the first small thing the two houses had agreed, without a single word of argument, to keep.